Today, we are going to be reading Judges 9, 1 through 21.
Judges chapter 9 is the story of Abimelech. Now, Abimelech is one of Gideon's sons who was born to Gideon from a concubine. And now Abimelech shows up, and he was not called by God at this time to be a judge. Israel didn't need to be delivered at this time, and so there was no need for a king or a judge. But it was Abimelech's pride, his ambition that was driving him. Maybe his mom gave him these thoughts of controlling the people, kind of to get back at Gideon in a way, maybe to show that her son was better than the 70 sons that Gideon had. We don't know. But we see that Abimelech uses his mother's family line to go to Shechem, the men of Shechem, his uncles essentially, and present his case to be king. Now the men of Shechem didn't appear to have any previous interest in making Abimelech king. As far as they're concerned, he wasn't on their radar, but he shows up, they hear his case, and they look around and they say, okay, why not? But we can read between the lines and see how Abimelech uses force and manipulation to come into this position of king. And ultimately, this is what leads to Abimelech's downfall. So let's start reading in Judges chapter 9, verse 1. Now Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem to his mother's relatives and said to them and to the whole clan of his mother's family, say in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? Remember also that I am your bone and flesh. And his mother's relatives spoke all these words on behalf in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. Abimelech tells them it would be better for you to have one person rule over you, me, versus 70 kings to rule over you, which would be Gideon's 70 sons. However, we have no reason to think that Gideon's 70 sons even wanted to be king or rule over Shechem or any part of the country. Most likely they took on their father's thought from chapter 8 verse 23 that said, no one shall rule over you but God. Not me, Gideon says, and not my sons and not their sons. Nonetheless, these men play right into Abimelech's scheme. Abimelech uses his father's name and his mother's blood to tickle their ears until they believe that his advancement would be their advantage. Verse 4, and they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. And he went to his father's house at Ophrah, and killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men, on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. And all the leaders of Shechem came together, and all Beth Millo, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar at Shechem. Abimelech here has convinced the men of Shechem, his uncles, to make him king. So they give him 70 pieces of silver from the temple, their offering that they presented to Baal-berith. Now at this time, people would present money, present goods, present their offerings to the gods. Number one, out of respect, but number two, in return for protection from the gods. As they battled their enemies, as they tried to take over more lands, they wanted protection from the gods. So they would present offerings and money. So the money that they took to pay Abimelech was the money that was laying at the altar of an idol. So we can assume here that Abimelech, instead of punishing idolatry, actually joins hands with the men of Shechem who are idolaters. Abimelech now becomes an idolater himself. This shows his true character. So with this money, he goes and he hires the worst guys of the city, scum of the earth. These are the only kind of guys that Abimelech can hire. That says a lot, doesn't it? If the only people who you can get to work for you are scum of the earth, scoundrels, worthless and reckless people, the Bible says, that says more about who you are. And as the saying goes, like father, like son, it applies here too, like leader, like followers. And again, we are seeing Abimelech's true character. Now in verse 5, we see how cruelly and viciously he goes to his father's hometown and he kills all 70 of his brothers on one stone. This is what prideful ambition, hatred, envy, jealousy, bitterness, when that stuff starts taking over, our hearts start to fester. And when that happens, we then are capable of doing things ordinarily before we might never have been capable of doing. And this is why the Bible is so clear that we have to guard our hearts, because out of our hearts show our true character. How we speak, how we respond, how we react, how we treat other people, that's all determined by the condition of our heart. We must do everything we can to guard our hearts at all cost. One last note on the 70 pieces of silver. Remember, there were 70 sons who were murdered. It's almost as if there was one piece of silver paid out for each murder. And so God wasn't consulted in this at all. In verses 5 and 6, we see that the men of Shechem, who were great men in the city, they allowed this to happen. And instead of punishing Abimelech for the 70 murders of his brothers, they go and they make him king. Now, why would they think that a king with blood on his hands from his own brothers would protect them? Why would they think that this man would have their best interest in mind when he had no regard for his own flesh and blood? Now we read at the end of verse 5 that Gideon's youngest son Jotham escapes. He's young, he's scared, he's running for his life. He sees his older brother coming in, murdering his other brothers, and he runs. Here in verse 7, we're going to see a little bit of Jotham's story. When it was told to Jotham, he went and stood at the top of Mount Gerizim and cried aloud and said to them. So Jotham has run away. He gets word that all of his brothers are killed. And he has to respond. And so the way he responds is he goes back to where Shechem is, and he stands on Mount Gerizim, and he starts speaking to the people. Now, isn't this a beautiful picture of how God works supernaturally in someone's life? Where once you were scared, where once you were running away, God empowers you to make a wrong right. And he is given courage and boldness and a voice that he probably didn't have before. And he stands on top of this mount and he begins speaking to the men of Shechem. And here's what he says. Middle of verse 7, listen to me, you leaders of Shechem, that God may listen to you. And just a note for us today. If we want God to speak to us, God is willing to speak to us. But sometimes we need to learn how to stop talking long enough for God to get a word in to our hearts, to our minds, put those thoughts of wrong to make right. We've got to be quiet long enough to listen to that. That's what Jotham is telling these men. You want God to listen to you? Well, then I'm speaking for God. You need to be quiet and listen to what I'm going to say right now. Verse 8. The trees once went out to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, shall I leave my abundance by which gods and men are honored and go hold sway over the trees? That's a no from the olive tree. And the tree said to the fig tree, you come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go hold sway over the trees? That's a no from the fig trees. And the tree said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine said to them, shall I leave my wine that cheers God and men and go hold sway over the trees? That's a no from the vine. Then all the trees said to the bramble, you come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Jotham was wise. He could have gathered an army out of the other cities in Israel to avenge his brothers, to honor his father, but he didn't. He got an opportunity to stand in front of the men of Shechem, and he took it. Now it says that he was at the top of Mount Gerizim, possibly during one of their festivals. So they have just made Abimelech king. They're feeling good. They've got their wine, they've got their food, they're celebrating, they're having a good time. And it's at this time that Jotham goes to make this proclamation to them. And they are willing to listen. They're feeling in a good mood. They're going to hear this young kid out. Remember, 2 verses prior to this, Jotham was the one running away. And now he's got this supernatural charge. He goes to these men and he just lays it out. In verse 7, he tells them that if they want God's favor, they would be wise to listen to what he has to say. The same thing goes for us today. If we expect God to hear our prayers, we've got to be willing to hear reason. We've got to be willing to hear correction. We've got to be willing to see and hear and feel the wrongs that have been made that we can make right. Proverbs 28:9 says this: if we turn away from hearing God's law, his word, our prayers are an abomination to God. I don't want my prayers to be an abomination. I want my prayers to be heard. And so what I have to do is I come to God and I have a conversation with him. I want to tell him what's on my heart, but then I want to give him a chance to kind of speak to my heart as well. Now in verse 8, Jotham begins talking kind of parabolically here. He's talking about the trees. He's talking about who they want to rule over them, to take sway over them. And that just means like a politician, how they get out with the people. They get out with the crowds. They're moving with the crowds. That's what makes a good politician, is someone who can represent the people, relate to the people. And that's what these big cedars are looking for, someone to take sway over them. It's exhausting. It's a big job. The olive tree, the fig tree, and the vine all turn it down. Now, the trees that Jotham mentions in verse 8 are representing the people. They're represented by cedars of Lebanon. Psalm 104:16 mentions cedars of Lebanon as people. What these big trees are only good for is shade. They don't produce any fruit. Their value actually comes when they're cut down. But they're the largest trees in the forest at this time. And it's interesting that these magnificent trees are now looking for a leader. And so they ask the olive tree and the fig tree and the vine to rule over them. Now these are fruit trees. They're not magnificent big trees. They offer no shade, no protection, but they do offer fruit, something sweet, something that's temporal, something that's satisfying for the moment, but it doesn't last. We all know that if we buy fruit and we come home and we leave it on our counter for a week and a half, it's probably not going to be good anymore because fruit spoils when it's off the vine. Now in verse 14, we can see the culmination that all three, the olive tree, the fig tree, and the vine, refuse to rule over the trees. They've got a good thing going. They're living their best life. They're giving God the glory. They are not interested in the position to hold sway over the trees. Now the bramble and the thistle that's mentioned in verse 14, this is going to represent Abimelech. And like the bramble, who is a worthless plant, he's useless. It's even harmful to a person or another animal or something that gets close to it. It scratches, it pokes, it draws blood. It's not a nice little bush. And yet this is who the people, the cedars of Lebanon, these magnificent trees, this is who they're asking to rule over them. Psalm 12:8 says this: men who are blind to their own interest, which the men of Shechem were at this point, we see, it says that they choose harmful leaders and guides. They are not being wise here. They are choosing to be ruled by a bramble bush. Verse 15, let's look how quickly the bramble says, yes, I'll do it, as if he had been born for this task. He assures them this is the right choice. He says, take refuge in my shade, as if anyone can come near a bramble bush without getting poked and scratched. But in all of his promise of shade and refuge, there's also a threat. Again, showing his true character. If they don't come to him, he says, if they don't obey him, fire will come out from the bramble bush and devour the cedars of Lebanon. How is this possible? How could one little thistle or bramble bush put out a fire to take down a forest of cedars? It seems impossible. This is a big game that Abimelech is talking here. He's using a really big threat. Let's move on to verse 16 through 20. Now therefore, Jotham says, if you acted in good faith and integrity when you made Abimelech king, and if you've dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house and have done to him as his deeds deserved, it's a little sarcastic here because they have not done this at all. Verse 17, for my father fought for you and risked his life and delivered you from the hand of Midian, and you have risen up against my father's house this day and have killed his sons, 70 men on one stone, and have made Abimelech, the son of his female servant, king over the leaders of Shechem, because he's your relative? Okay, if you then have acted in good faith, if you really think this was a good idea, you've acted in faith and integrity with Jerubbaal and with his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the leaders of Shechem and Beth Millo, and let fire come out from the leaders of Shechem and from Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. So Jotham's almost predicting a fight between the two groups, between Abimelech and between the men of Shechem. He's almost predicting that they're going to turn on each other at some point. Don't know how it's going to happen. They probably are feeling a little confused about this. This is a big moment for Jotham. In other words, he's saying if you can justify all the evil you've done to the house of Gideon, then may it go well with you and your new king. Let's read the last verse in our study today, verse 21. And Jotham ran away and fled and went to Beer and lived there because of Abimelech, his brother. So after this stern admonition, Jotham runs for his life. He escapes and he hides. Either the men couldn't reach him from where he was standing on top of that little mount, he was too fast, he got away too fast, or because they had been convicted of their actions, of what had just happened, that they allowed Abimelech to kill his 70 brothers and then they make him king. Either way, Jotham is able to run away and flee, and he takes refuge in another town called Beer. Jotham's story goes from running away scared, being supernaturally strengthened by God, and then running away again. Now, I don't think Jotham is a coward at all. I think this is the way God works, even in our lives today. We're faced with a situation that has us freaked out, and our first natural response is to run away. But then God says, you know what? I need you to go back. I'm going to supernaturally strengthen you for this task, no matter what it is. You could be faced with any crisis, and your first reaction might be to run. But if you let it sit, and you just listen to God, He might be telling you, I'm going to give you some strength to push through this crisis. I'm going to give you some supernatural ability to overcome this situation that you thought was really scary, and it is really scary. And as soon as your task is done, as soon as God gives you the strength and the courage and the boldness to finish the task that He's given you, to overcome your crisis, to overcome your hardship, Jotham, we see, runs away again. And I don't think he's running out of fear. I think he's running because he's smart. Maybe he wants to get married. Maybe he desires children. He knows that if he stays, he could be killed. And so he runs away, not out of fear. In this moment, it's not out of fear. In this moment, I believe it's for his own protection. And I think it's smart. And I think for us too, there's moments when we run, there's moments when we get strengthened and we face our challenges head on, and then there's moments when we protect ourselves. And knowing when to choose which one to do comes from spending time in God's presence. That's it. Spending time with God, listening to Him, letting Him fill you, letting Him speak to you. That's how we can know what direction we need to go in next. That's how we know what step do I take next. Stay in the presence of God. Press into Him. Push into Him. See where He leads you, and then follow closely behind.